Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful for the honour conferred upon me by Libera, and I'm extremely grateful for the very kind comments of Mr. Theodore, who is one of those very rare beings, a genuinely intellectual politician. I must say that the interview that I gave with a radio station recently, just now in fact, the interviewer did not share my opinion. But it's a great pleasure to know Mr. Dalrymple. It's always a great pleasure because he clearly enjoys life, which is something which our politicians in Britain are careful to appear not to do, in case they should be thought to lack sufficient compassion for the suffering people of their own country and the rest of the world, whom it is their duty to save from unhappiness. I think it's only right after praise to allude to some of the deficiencies or shortcomings of my own work, of which I'm only too aware. I've conducted little research that could be called scientific, and I'm certainly not an academic, and I haven't really even formulated a consistent philosophy or even tried to do so. And lack of theoretical rigour is an accusation that is often brought, perhaps justly, against British intellectual life and tradition, which is marked by an unformed empiricism. However, there are also certain advantages to such a tradition, which incidentally is now dying out, much to my own country's detriment. One of the advantages being a refusal to view reality through the lens of an arcane or elaborate and much cherished theory. And in my case, my work has resulted from direct observation both in my own country and in much of the Third World, where I had the opportunity to observe poverty not in the relative but in the absolute sense. And I observed it firsthand as a doctor. And I have for a long time reflected on my direct observations in a fairly elementary way. Well, let me tell you what I regard as my most fundamental discovery. I mean, it was a discovery for me, not for anyone else in the rest of the world, that nevertheless, quite a lot of people still find deeply shocking that poor people, whether they be poor in the absolute or relative sense, are fully conscious human beings who are endowed with the capacity to think, to calculate, desire, make decisions, and so forth, in the same way that more fortunately placed people do. Here, let me adapt slightly Shylock's great speech in The Merchant of Venice. Have not the poor eyes, have not the poor hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as the richer are? If you prick them, do they not bleed? If you tickle them, do they not laugh? If you poison them, do they not die? And if you wrong them, shall they not revenge? This does not mean, of course, that poverty, relative or absolute, has no practical consequences. If it didn't, it would hardly be undesirable or worth escaping from. But it does mean that we ought never to forget that those consequences are greatly affected and modified by the mentality of the poor, and that this mentality is itself affected not merely by material, but more importantly by cultural circumstances and above all by ideas. And I hope you will forgive me if I now refer mainly to the British experience. I refer to it mostly because I know it best, but fundamental similarities in Western European countries encourage me to hope that what I say will not be totally irrelevant to the situation elsewhere. And besides, we in Britain are the European leaders in social pathology, if in nothing else, and attention to the British example should be useful if only as a warning as to what can happen if certain trends are allowed to go too far. Here, let me disabuse you of the notion peddled by the French press, if any of you read it, a notion that is a sign of its laziness, intellectual torpor, and incuriosity about economic, social, and political reality, outre-Manche. A laziness, intellectual torpor, and incuriosity fully equalled, of course, by the British press about French reality. Namely, that Britain is some kind of neoliberal state where economic freedom, read in tooth and claw, is quite unrestrained. To the contrary, Britain is increasingly a corporatist state, which could easily be redirected into a fascist direction, in my belief, in which the main freedom for a very large percentage of its population is freedom from the economic consequences of its own reckless, immature, childish, foolish, or downright criminal behaviour. Large areas of the country are in effect the Soviet Union with supermarkets. Millions of people live in effect on charity and have done so for generations. The sole economic activity of a town in which I stayed recently in Wales was the administration of unemployment and the bogus attempt to ameliorate social pathology. At least 3/4 of the town's economic activity was governmental, and that which was nominally private consisted of supermarkets relieving the population of its income that was derived solely from the government, that is to say, from the taxation of economically active persons elsewhere. These supermarkets were, in effect, licensed traders, for the administrative and other barriers to trade in our corporatist state are now so large and effectively policed, unlike the policing of real crime, of course, that relative poverty does not call forth any economic or commercial activity by those who suffer it, other than illegal trafficking. The people can neither improve nor worsen their economic prospects by their own efforts, and this leads to a listlessness and self-abandonment that is evident, for example, in, and I hope this is not too near the bone, in obesity so great that it is not uncommon to see people of 40, I'm talking about this Welsh town, 40, who need walking sticks or even electrically powered wheelchairs, thoughtfully provided by the ever-solicitous state, to move around outside their homes. This is very common and can be seen in every British town. One potential escape from this unenviable situation, education, has effectively been closed. And I'm here speaking grosso modo, of course. I do not mean that there are no exceptions. Here we see a typical example of the bloated but ineffectual state. Expenditure in Britain on education doubled between 2000 and 2007 alone, yet standards almost certainly fell, and they were already very low. In some, and I could describe the standards if you wished. In the same years that the education expenditure was doubling, the proportion of British school children learning a foreign language, never, let us be frank, one of the strong points of British pedagogy, declined by at least 2/3. This was because the government, while it was doubling expenditure, released schools from the obligation to teach foreign languages. Why did it do so? Because it wanted schools to be able to claim that their results were improving, and since, even in our debased times, it is difficult to give a pass to a pupil in a French examination who does not know the meaning of bonjour, schools switched to subjects in which it was possible to pass examinations on the basis of no knowledge whatsoever. And many such subjects seem to have been invented for specifically this purpose. Thus, the intellectually, morally, and financially corrupt circle is closed. Pay more, get less in return, and claim that everything is getting better all the time. In the process, you get an ever greater percentage of the population to vote for you for doing precisely this, because it is economically dependent upon it. Stalin might have envied the whole system, or at least admired the cunning of it. There is now, for example, one classroom assistant for every 30 pupils in Britain, teaching assistants being a new category of worker called into being by a combination of vastly expensive social policy leading to radically unsocialized children who won't because they cannot behave, on the one hand, and disgracefully idiotic but state-promoted and financed pedagogical methods on the other. These classroom assistants are no doubt ill-paid, but fear that, if it were not for their make-work, they would not be paid at all, and therefore vote for the hands that feed them. And there are now 250,000 such people, and an increasing number, a not inconsiderable number of votes. No politician or